Elijah Maris stood frozen at the chalkboard. 17. Black and already judged while his white Ivy League professor smirked behind him. "Show us if you even belong here," she said loud enough for the class to laugh. But when Elijah lifted the chalk, he didn't just solve her signature equation, he exposed it. And as whispers turned to fear, one question spread like wildfire. How did he already know the formula she built her career on? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The rustle of high-end backpacks, the hum of whispered conversations, and the rhythmic clatter of mechanical pencils filled the cavernous lecture hall of Sterling University. Thermodynamics 301 had just begun. At first glance, it was a routine morning in an elite institution, where ambition dressed itself in Patagonia vests and Ivy League hoodies. Rows of seats curved like a semicircle around the whiteboard, each one occupied by carefully curated students, the kind who measured their worth in GPA, research internships, and family legacies. Some sat close to the front with necks craned upward like loyal disciples of academia. Others slouched further back, passively present, but in the highest, most distant row, one student's presence defied expectation. Elijah Maris, 17 years old, black, soft-spoken and effortlessly brilliant. Elijah didn't fit the usual image of a third-year thermodynamics student. Most of his classmates were 20 or older, legacies of white physicists and venture capitalists. Elijah, on the other hand, arrived on campus with no family name echoing through the alumni halls. He had no LinkedIn profile groomed since sophomore year of high school. His worn sneakers and off-brand hoodie stood out in a lecture hall, where name brands were a language of belonging. And yet, there he sat, notebook balanced on one knee, fingers ink-stained, not from negligence but from obsession. The kind of obsession only those who had something to prove knew intimately. His notebook, filled with hand-drawn schematics and tiny formulaic branches, was a universe unto itself, unlike the polished MacBooks surrounding him. Elijah's tools of learning were analog, intimate, personal. He wrote like he was mapping his own mind, not solving textbook problems. He didn't speak much. Not in lectures, not in labs, not in the dining hall. His silence was not timidity. It was strategy. A quiet armor forged over years of navigating spaces where being black and gifted meant being doubted before you were seen. Professor Dr. Mallory Crenshaw entered with her usual flair, her heels echoing sharply across the polished floors. At 41, she was the youngest tenured professor in Sterling's physics department, a white woman with a doctorate in applied thermodynamics and a reputation for intellectual brutality. Students feared her, revered her, envied her. Her teaching style walked the razor edge between inspirational and invasive. She had little tolerance for error, and even less for anything she deemed performative. Today, as she approached the whiteboard, she did so with a different kind of energy, sharper, cold. "Let's talk entropy," she began, removing the cap from her marker with a flick. Her handwriting sprawled across the board with swift authority, each stroke deliberate. Equations unfurled like threads of code, and the students kept pace, more or less. Some scribbled desperately. Others copied slides. A few recorded the lecture in real time on tablets. But Elijah? He wrote with a rhythm all his own, turning abstract principles into diagrams, layering his notes with insights the lecture hadn't even touched. It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. Halfway through the lecture, Crenshaw paused. She turned from the board, squinting up at the back of the room. Her eyes settled on Elijah. "You," she said, voice slicing through the murmur. "Back row, with the rocket notebook." A few students chuckled. Others craned their necks to see. Elijah looked up, calm and unreadable. "You've been scribbling like you're solving cold fusion back there. Why don't you share something with the rest of us?" Her tone teetered between mockery and challenge, and the tension in the room shifted instantly. A few more snickers rose. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply closed his notebook, stood, and walked down the aisle with a quiet confidence that hushed the murmurs. Every step seemed to echo. Professor Crenshaw stepped aside and wrote a new equation on the board. It wasn't just any problem. It was a notoriously tricky derivation, dense with variable traps and disguised inconsistencies. A kind of litmus test for humility. "Solve this," she said, handing Elijah the marker. He took it, staring at the equation. For a moment the room held its breath. Then, with precise movements, he began to write. He restructured the formula, bypassed the obvious misdirection, introduced a nonlinear transformation, the class hadn't seen yet, and bridged two branches of thermodynamic logic into a solution that not only answered the question but elevated it. The room fell into stunned silence. Even Crenshaw, arms crossed tightly, couldn't mask her surprise. Her jaw tensed, the corners of her mouth twitching, as if she couldn't decide whether to frown or smirk. Elijah capped the marker, placed it back on the ledge, and said in a voice, barely above a whisper, "It simplifies here." Then he turned, walked back to his seat, and resumed his note-taking as if nothing had happened. It took a moment before the students reacted. Someone whispered, "Wait, he actually solved it." Another asked, "Did he just invent a shortcut?" A third muttered, "That wasn't even in the reading." Crenshaw stared at the board, silent. The derivation was flawless. It wasn't luck. It wasn't memorization. It was understanding. Raw, rare, undeniable. "Lucky guess," she said finally, voice brittle. But the words didn't land. The class wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't even smiling. Something unspoken passed through them, an awareness that a boundary had been crossed, not by Elijah, but by her, and in that moment, Dr. Mallory Crenshaw understood something that terrified her more than she admitted. Elijah Maris was not just gifted, he was undeniable. The bell rang moments later, releasing the class into the halls of the university. But the story didn't end with the sound of closing notebooks. Word spread fast. It always did. Within an hour, a few students had whispered about the kid who stumped Crenshaw. By evening, someone had recreated Elijah's derivation on Reddit. It was upvoted hundreds of times before midnight. Elijah, as always, remained silent. He didn't respond to the messages, didn't answer the knock on his dorm door from a curious sophomore majoring in engineering, didn't smile when the janitor who mopped his floor gave him a slow, proud nod. But inside, something stirred. Not pride, not relief. Something quieter, older, a sense of danger. He had drawn attention. And attention, for boys like him, was rarely a reward. Elijah solves a mid-lecture equation on the board in seconds, leaving half the class stunned, and one professor furious. The next lecture opened with a tension that felt charged, almost physical, as if the air itself sensed what had unfolded 2 days earlier. Students whispered before the professor arrived, some leaning across rows, others glancing repeatedly toward the back where Elijah Maris sat in his usual seat. His quiet presence had become a focal point, an unspoken point of curiosity. Elijah kept his gaze low, notebook open, pen balanced between his fingers. He didn't need to look up to know he had become the center of something. Tension, suspicion, resentment, curiosity, all churning quietly beneath the facade of academia. He sensed the shift in energy, the shift that always came when someone crossed an invisible boundary they weren't supposed to touch. When Professor Mallory Crenshaw entered, her heels struck the floor with crisp finality. There was no warm greeting, no anecdote to ease the students in. She walked directly to the whiteboard, pulled out a red marker, something she never used, and uncapped it with a sharp click. "Today," she announced, her voice steady but taut, "we're going to push boundaries." Her eyes swept the room, moving slowly across faces, until they landed on Elijah. She held her gaze there, long enough for the room to sense her intention. "Mr. Maris," she said, the syllables wrapped in polished authority, "since you demonstrated impressive speed last class, why don't you walk us through the derivation of the Carnot efficiency limit?" A few students chuckled under their breath, not because the request was funny, but because they recognized the tone, the slight edge, the patronizing curiosity that always came before a test not meant to measure brilliance, but to expose it as illegitimate. Elijah stood slowly, walked to the front and accepted the marker from her hand. Without hesitation, he began writing, tracing each mathematical step with calm precision. Students leaned forward, some whispering in disbelief, some squinting at the board. His derivation was clean, elegant, correct. Crenshaw stared at it too long before offering an icy, brittle laugh. "Well," she said, "speed isn't everything, but thank you." He returned to his seat, and the lesson continued, but not naturally. Each time Crenshaw wrote something, her strokes were sharp, her explanations clipped, and she called on Elijah again, and again, and again. Each question crafted to look like encouragement, but framed with an undertone that questioned his legitimacy. "Are you sure you understand this step?" she'd ask. "Your approach seems unconventional. Perhaps you'd like to revise your answer." Elijah answered calmly, refusing to let his voice shake, but inside he felt the familiar burn, the subtle humiliation delivered with a smile, the pressure of being the only black student expected to prove, again and again, that he belonged. By the third time she singled him out, students noticed. By the fifth, they exchanged glances. By the eighth, tension filled the room thick enough to choke on. Finally, one girl, Avery, raised her hand timidly and asked why all the questions were going to Elijah. Crenshaw froze, then snapped her head toward her. "Are you implying I'm being unfair?" Avery wilted instantly, shaking her head. "Good," Crenshaw said sharply, "because I treat every student the same." Everyone in the room knew that wasn't true, but no one dared press further. When class dismissed, students gathered their things quickly, eager to escape. Behind Elijah, whispers rose just loud enough for him to hear. "She's doing it because she thinks he cheated last class," one said. Another replied, "No way he solved that thing that fast." A third voice added quietly, almost smugly, "I mean, you know how admissions works now?" Elijah didn't react. He just closed his notebook and walked out with the same quiet dignity he always carried. But inside, something tightened. A familiar heaviness, a reminder that his silence, not his intelligence, was what people questioned first. 2 days later, he walked into the next lecture hall and felt the shift instantly. Students' eyes followed him, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, and some with an unspoken expectation of whatever might happen next. Crenshaw stood at the board when he arrived, posture rigid, expression tense. When the clock hit the hour, she turned to the class with chilling composure. "Before we begin," she said, "I've decided something." The room quieted. Her eyes swept across the students, passing over dozens of faces, before stopping, predictably, on Elijah. "We're having a pop quiz." Gasps spread through the hall. Pop quizzes were rare, unheard of. Crenshaw placed a stack of papers on her desk. "It will cover material from last week. Concepts. Some of you," she paused, her gaze locking onto Elijah, "seem particularly confident about." A weight dropped into the room. Students glanced around nervously. Crenshaw's voice sharpened. "I think it's only fair to make sure everyone is truly keeping up, especially those who appear to have mastered complex derivations with remarkable ease." She stepped closer to her desk, resting one hand on the stack of quizzes. Then, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, she said, "Let's see if you're as smart as your silence." The sentence landed like a slap, subtle enough to be defensible, sharp enough to wound. Elijah didn't move, didn't react, but a quiet resolve settled inside him, cold and firm. Crenshaw began passing the quizzes down the rows. As she placed one on Elijah's desk, something caught his eye, something no one else could see. Under the top sheet in her hand, faint but unmistakable, his name was circled in red ink. Next to it, handwritten in the margin, were 3 words that froze him in place. "Flag for review." A message not meant for students' eyes. A warning, a threat, a plan. And suddenly Elijah understood. This wasn't a quiz. This was a setup. A trap disguised as evaluation. A test designed not just to challenge him, but to break him. And Crenshaw. She was watching him closely, waiting to see how he reacted. But Elijah, quiet, brilliant, underestimated Elijah, didn't blink. He lowered his eyes to the paper, hiding the storm forming behind them. This time, silence wouldn't protect him. It would expose him, unless he turned the game on her. Elijah stares at the words "flag for review," realizing Crenshaw has already decided he's guilty before he even lifts his pencil. The weight of the quiz settled over the lecture hall like a thick fog, dense enough to stifle even the usual murmurs that drifted through the room before class. Students sat stiffly, their eyes darting between the stack of papers on Professor Crenshaw's desk and Elijah, who sat motionless in the back row with his posture composed but taut. The words "flag for review" still pulsed in his mind like a flashing red warning sign. He hadn't removed the image from his memory. He didn't want to. It served as a reminder. Whatever was coming next wasn't just about thermodynamics. It was about him, his presence, his legitimacy in a room where he was never meant to stand out. Certainly not by surpassing the professor who built her career on being untouchable. Crenshaw began distributing the quiz papers. Her movements were precise, controlled, but beneath that facade, something unsteady simmered: frustration, fear, ego. Elijah watched her approach, the red ink still vivid in his mind. When she slid the quiz onto his desk, she didn't look at him. That was the first warning. The second was the faint upward twitch of her lip, the kind of half-smile one had when already anticipating someone's failure. As the clock ticked, Students bent over their papers, pencils scratching nervously. Elijah read through the first question carefully. It was harder than usual, not graduate-level hard, but intentionally dense, designed to trip anyone who didn't parse every variable twice. The second question was brittle with mathematical landmines. The third was phrased in a way that almost guaranteed misinterpretation. And then the fourth, the longest, was a trap disguised as elegant. Elijah recognized it instantly. It was a variation of the equation he'd solved in front of the class, but manipulated just enough that anyone who tried to replicate his earlier method would fail. He inhaled once, slow and steady. She wants me to slip. She wants proof. He adjusted his grip on the pencil before writing his first line. He understood the strategy he needed now. Not excellence, but precision. This quiz wasn't about demonstrating brilliance. It was about refusing to give Crenshaw ammunition. Each solution had to be perfect, not flashy. He worked through the problems with methodical calm, but inside his thoughts buzzed with the buried voices of men in his family. His father, his uncle, his grandfather. 3 generations. Black men who learned to shrink themselves in white spaces for safety. Elijah had inherited their silence, their fear, their survival instincts. A chair scraped loudly somewhere in the third row. Someone muttered, "Why is he taking so long?" A girl whispered back, "Maybe last time really was a fluke." Another voice joined, "My roommate says he only got in because of some scholarship program." The whispers were not subtle anymore. They floated easily, comfortably, through the rows, as if Elijah's genius had rewritten the room's unwritten rules, and now everyone was recalculating what they believed a black prodigy was allowed to be. Elijah kept writing. 10 minutes later, Crenshaw paced between rows like a courtroom judge, inspecting her jury. Her heels clicked in sharp rhythm, and her gaze flicked to Elijah every few seconds, looking for hesitation, uncertainty, panic. Anything she could claim was evidence that his brilliance had been accidental. But Elijah's expression remained steady, controlled, blank in a way that made her jaw tighten. Halfway through the quiz, a sudden whisper sliced through the silence, followed by stifled laughter. "You think he cheated off Reddit? That solution went viral." Another added, "Probably memorized it." It didn't matter how quietly they whispered. Their glances toward the back row made their target clear, and in that moment, the lecture hall didn't feel like a classroom anymore. It felt like a courtroom where Elijah's identity was on trial. For a few seconds, Elijah's fingers froze. His pencil hovered above the page. A familiar ache rose from deep within his ribs. The ache of every accusation he'd dodged growing up. Every test he'd taken under narrowed stares. Every moment he had to prove not that he was brilliant, but that he did not steal brilliance. Then slowly he exhaled. He would not allow them to direct his narrative. Not here. Not today. He finished the quiz with 10 minutes to spare. His answers were concise, mathematically elegant without unnecessary complexities. Crenshaw could twist into suspicious sophistication. As students approached her desk to submit their papers, the mood shifted. Conversations sparked again. Some hesitant, others openly speculative. "I heard kids like him train for these questions." "Train? For thermodynamics?" "No. Like, competition prep. Ivy League booster stuff." "That doesn't make sense." "Neither does he." Elijah collected his bag in silence and stood, ignoring the students lined up in the aisle. When he walked past them to hand in his quiz, their voices dipped but didn't disappear. They watched him like an unpredictable phenomenon. Fascination blended with discomfort, tinted with something far uglier. Crenshaw accepted his paper without meeting his eyes. But as her fingers brushed the sheet, she paused long enough to suggest she was memorizing how it felt in her hand, as if she believed the paper itself carried evidence of wrongdoing. Elijah said nothing. He simply placed the quiz on the stack, then turned and walked out of the room with steady steps. The murmurs behind him rose. As the door closed, the hallway outside was quiet, but Elijah kept walking, feeling the quiz like a weight pressing into his spine. He didn't check his phone, didn't respond to the messages that pinged, didn't slow down until he reached the courtyard. He stopped beneath an oak tree and closed his eyes for a brief moment, not for peace but to brace himself for what would come next. He knew professors like Crenshaw didn't challenge students publicly without following through privately. He knew classmates who believed their privilege gave them the right to question his place wouldn't stop whispering after a quiz, and he knew deeply that silence had its limits. Sooner or later he would be forced to speak, but not today, not when the walls were listening. He walked back to his dorm, each step sinking deeper into the awareness that the spotlight now glued to him was not admiration. It was suspicion shaped like curiosity. That night, the campus felt different. A few students stared when he passed. Others avoided eye contact, as if looking at him too long meant acknowledging something uncomfortable. Even the dining hall felt colder. He sat alone, ate quickly, then disappeared into the quiet of his dorm room, shutting the door softly behind him. He didn't turn on the lights at first. He let the darkness wrap around him, letting out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding since the quiz began. There was a knock on his door around 9. Soft, hesitant. "Elijah?" someone whispered. He didn't answer. The knock came again, but he didn't move. He wasn't ready. Not for sympathy, not for curiosity, and certainly not for whatever new assumptions had formed since the quiz ended. When the knocking finally stopped, Elijah stood at his desk and placed his notebook down gently. Inside its pages were diagrams and formulas that belonged to him, unapologetically his. And yet, in this institution, even his own work didn't feel fully safe. He sat on his bed and stared ahead, letting the room's silence settle. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that the world outside his dorm was shifting faster than he was prepared for. Something had already started circulating. Something he didn't create. Something he wouldn't even see until morning. And when the sun came up, Sterling University would no longer look at him with curiosity. It would look at him with uproar. The quiz ends. Elijah walks out quietly. But by the next morning, the results are everywhere. Viral, shared, dissected, and none of it came from him. By morning, Sterling University felt like a different ecosystem. The quiet winter air had turned brittle, with gossip, and digital screens across campus glowed with the same headline: "Freshman Prodigy Aces Impossible Quiz, Professor Under Scrutiny." The words were plastered on Reddit, student forums, group chats, and even departmental listservs. Elijah wasn't supposed to be on. Someone had leaked the scores. Someone had leaked his score. And someone had crafted a narrative around it that suggested he wasn't just gifted, he was disruptive, unsettling, a threat to the balance of academic hierarchy. When Elijah walked across the quad that morning, he felt the shift immediately. White students who had previously ignored him now looked at him with tight-lipped half-smiles, the kind that masked discomfort. Others whispered as he passed, their voices carried by the crisp air. "That's him. He got a perfect score. No one else did." Crenshaw's pissed. He embarrassed her. It wasn't admiration, not even close. It was fascination tinted with unease. But the reaction that hit deepest didn't come from them. It came from the students who looked like him. At Sterling, the Black Student Union wasn't just a club, it was a lifeline. A network built for survival in a space that wasn't designed for them. Elijah had never been deeply involved, not because he didn't want to be, but because he never felt he had the right to insert himself. He carried his silence everywhere, even in spaces meant to be safe. But that morning, those same students didn't greet him. They didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't offer acknowledgement. They stared, not with pride, with disappointment, accusation, distance. When Elijah entered the student center to grab a coffee, 3 black students from BSU stood near the vending area. Avery, the same girl who had spoken up in class days earlier, glanced at him and quickly looked away, her expression drawn and conflicted. A tall engineering major named Roman, someone Elijah recognized but barely knew, stepped forward a little as Elijah walked past. "So that's how you want to play it?" Roman murmured under his breath, loud enough to be heard. Elijah paused. He turned slightly, not enough to make it confrontational, but enough to show he heard. "What do you mean?" Roman huffed a laugh, low and humorless. "Act confused if you want. But you know exactly what I mean." Elijah frowned softly. "I really don't." Roman stepped closer, checking their surroundings before speaking again. "You think going toe-to-toe with Crenshaw and making a spectacle out of it helps any of us? You think showing off in front of them makes us look better? You're playing their game, man." Elijah blinked slowly, feeling the words settle heavy against his ribs. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe a neutral reaction, maybe silence, but a very shifted uncomfortably. "Roman, stop," she muttered, but her voice lacked firmness. He ignored her. "You embarrassed her, and when they come after you, and they will, they won't hesitate to drag all of us with you." Elijah inhaled, steadying himself. "I didn't embarrass anyone. She called on me. She singled me out." Roman scoffed. You didn't have to go above and beyond. You didn't have to solve it like that. You know how they look at us. You know what they think when one of us sticks out. Very added quietly, excellence gets weaponized here, Elijah, against all of us. The words hit him harder than he expected. His throat tightened. He knew what they meant. He lived under that same weight, every day. But hearing it from them, framed as an accusation rather than shared grief, sliced deeper. Before he could respond, another girl approached. Jada, a senior known for her activism on campus. She gave Elijah a long, disappointed look. This school already thinks we're either charity cases or troublemakers, she said softly. You proving you are smarter than everyone doesn't protect us. It paints a target. Elijah's chest felt tight. I didn't prove anything, he said quietly. I just answered a question. Roman shook his head slowly. Not everything needs an answer. The conversation ended there, but the sting lingered long after Elijah walked away. He carried their words with him as he moved through campus, each one pressing into him like unwelcome fingerprints. By noon, the cafeteria buzzed with louder whispers. A group of black sophomores eyed him as he passed their table, one muttering just loud enough. He's one of them now. Another added, let him learn the hard way. The words burned. Elijah didn't respond. He kept his posture straight, his face calm, his learned armor of silence. But inside, an invisible tear formed. To be doubted by the professor felt expected. To be scrutinized by white students felt predictable. But to be rejected by his own community, that was a different pain, sharp and personal. As he left the cafeteria, two first-year black students whispered, not realizing their voices carried. He probably thinks he's special. That's what they want. A model. He's embarrassing us. He had never felt more profoundly alone. That afternoon, Elijah sat on a bench behind the science building, notebook in his lap, trying to steady himself. His hands shook slightly. Anger, sadness, confusion, all tangled into one tight knot. He hated that he cared. He hated that their words mattered, but they did, because he knew their fear wasn't baseless. There was history behind it. Generations of it. But he wasn't playing a game. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to outshine anyone. He was just surviving. Footsteps approached. Elijah didn't look up, hoping whoever it was would walk past. But Avery stopped in front of him, hugging her coat around her. Her expression had softened, but not enough to erase the tension between them. Elijah, she said quietly. Can we talk? He looked up, eyes dim. About what? How I'm a problem for everyone. Avery flinched. That's not what I meant. It's what everyone said. She sat beside him, leaving a respectful space. It's just you scared people. You shifted the attention. And you know how this place works. They don't like when we get attention unless it's the kind that fits their narrative. Elijah stared at the ground. So I'm supposed to dim myself down, pretend I don't understand something, make mistakes so people feel safe around me. Avery sighed. No, that's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? He asked softly, voice cracking in a way he didn't anticipate. She paused, searching for words. I'm saying you're not wrong, but you're not alone either. And sometimes when you move too fast, the rest of us feel the wind before we're ready. Elijah exhaled shakily. It was the closest thing to empathy he'd heard all day, but it wasn't enough to close the wound. Avery stood again, pulling her scarf tighter. I know you're not trying to hurt anyone, she whispered, but people are scared, and fear makes them lash out. He nodded faintly, not trusting his voice. She offered a small, sad smile before walking away, leaving him in the cold afternoon air. By evening, Elijah retreated to his dorm, the only place where the world couldn't reach him. Or so he thought. He sat on his bed, head leaning back against the wall, eyes closed. The day's echoes replayed, every whisper, every accusation, every moment of disappointment. He felt stretched thin, like a wire pulled to breaking point. Around midnight, he finally stood to lock his door, meeting a barrier between himself and the campus that suddenly felt hostile from every direction. But just as he reached for the lock, a soft sliding sound broke the silence. Paper slipping against linoleum. Elijah froze. Then he looked down. An envelope lay beneath his door. No name, no handwriting, just plain white and cold. He knelt slowly and picked it up, his pulse quickening. Inside, a single ripped piece of lined paper carried 5 handwritten words. We know what you really are. Elijah's heart dropped. Someone wasn't whispering anymore. Someone was targeting him. An anonymous note under Elijah's door reads, "We know what you really are." Professor Mallory Crenshaw sat in her office, surrounded by the emblems of her legacy. Awards for innovation in applied thermodynamics, golden-plated plaques, etched with her name, and framed photos from symposiums, where she stood among elite physicists. Each accolade reinforced her image: brilliant, exacting, untouchable. For years she'd controlled her narrative at Sterling University, with flawless precision. But now, that control was slipping, all because of a quiet black boy, who had, with a single piece of chalk and barely a sentence, cracked through the wall she'd spent years building. She'd tried to dismiss it, to reduce it to a fluke. But the campus hadn't moved on. Students were still talking, and worse, professors had begun to whisper. One had suggested that Elijah's solution could warrant a paper of its own. Another asked if she would be revisiting her problem set structure given recent developments. Every question sounded polite, but she knew what they meant. Her authority, her claim to dominance in the field, was being challenged, not by a rival academic, but by a 17-year-old freshman with a second-hand notebook and a target on his back. It hadn't started in that lecture. The obsession had begun long before, hidden beneath layers of denial. She remembered Elijah's admissions file. One essay in particular stood out. He wrote about entropy, as metaphor, describing his experience navigating institutional systems that always viewed his intelligence with suspicion. At the time, she'd dismissed it as overwritten, too poetic for a science applicant. She'd flagged the file mentally, wondering how someone from a low-income public school could articulate thermodynamics so clearly. When he was admitted and quietly took his place in her class, she paid attention, but at a distance. It wasn't until he showed her up, calmly solving her twisted derivation in front of a packed hall, that she could no longer contain the unease brewing beneath her title. Now, alone in her office, she reviewed Elijah's grades. Impeccable. His name had begun showing up on internal university discussion threads. A few donors had even requested more information about the genius freshman. Crenshaw's jaw clenched. It wasn't admiration that pulsed through her. It was fear. Fear that her legacy could be eclipsed. Fear that the institution she'd dominated for years might begin to elevate someone she couldn't control. A black student, no less. In her department, she needed to reassert dominance. Not with another quiz, not with emails or warnings. She needed to do it publicly, undeniably, in a way that made the campus and Elijah remember who held the power here. She knew exactly how. 2 days later, the lecture hall was overflowing. Word had spread fast. Crenshaw was preparing something big. Graduate students squeezed in alongside undergrads. Faculty members slipped into the back rows. A few local journalists lingered outside, aware of the online buzz building around the Elijah versus Crenshaw spectacle. This was no longer just a lecture. It was a performance, and everyone wanted front row seats. Elijah walked in just before the clock struck the hour. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Conversations stalled. Heads turned. The whispers started. Low but undeniable. That's him. She's gonna tear him apart today. She wrote something new, something no one's ever solved. Elijah said nothing. He scanned the rows, noticed the unfamiliar faces, and felt the familiar sensation of his stomach coiling. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be academic. Professor Crenshaw entered exactly on time, her presence commanding and sharp. She wore her authority like armor. Flawless suit. Hair pulled tight. Voice steady. She didn't greet the class. She didn't explain. Instead, she walked to the whiteboard, and with deliberate strokes began to write. The silence grew as the equation unfolded. It wasn't just complex, it was punishing. Layer upon layer of interdependent variables, misdirections baked into the algebra, symmetrical traps, designed to confuse even postdoctoral minds. This was her weapon, her signature problem, long considered unsolvable. She had introduced it once in a published lecture series, claiming it was purely theoretical. Today she was weaponizing it. When she finished, she capped her marker and turned to the room. "This," she announced, "is the edge of understanding. A boundary where even certainty begins to fail." Her voice was even, but her eyes hunted. Then she said it. "Elijah Maris, come solve it." A ripple of shock moved through the hall. Someone laughed nervously. Someone gasped. All eyes turned to the back row. Elijah sat frozen. This wasn't teaching. This was a public execution. Still slowly, he stood and walked forward. His footsteps echoed louder than usual, each one tightening the pressure in the air. Crenshaw stood aside and handed him the marker. "Let's see what silence is worth today," she said under her breath. Elijah stared at the board. At first it was overwhelming, chaotic. Then, slowly, it began to unfold in his mind. He saw the traps, the loops, the distractions, but instead of attacking the problem head-on, he did something unexpected. He spoke. "I didn't ask for this," he said calmly, turning to the audience. "I didn't come here to compete. I didn't come here to threaten anyone. I came here to learn." The room went silent. Crenshaw narrowed her eyes. "I was asked to answer questions. I did. I didn't ask to be turned into a symbol. I didn't ask to be targeted." Then he turned back to the board and lifted the marker. He didn't solve the problem in the traditional way. He rewrote it, reframed the entire approach, broke it down not by force, but by logic. Each line of work he added peeled back a layer of the equation's armor. Gasps rose as he reversed terms, exposed redundancies, simplified the mess Crenshaw had carefully constructed. 20 minutes later, the room was still, stunned. Elijah stepped back. The equation had been solved, but he wasn't done. He turned to Crenshaw, handed her the marker, and said, "You hit a symmetry in the second matrix transformation. That's why no one ever found the clean path. But it was there." Crenshaw stared at the board, face pale, jaw clenched. No one moved. No one spoke, because everyone had seen it. Her legacy, her control, her performance, all dismantled by the one person she tried to silence. And as Elijah walked back to his seat, head high, the whispers started again, but this time they carried awe. She writes the unsolvable thermodynamics question she's famous for, and calls Elijah to the board in front of 300 students. Elijah stood before the board, marker in hand, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow into that singular space between his fingertips and the symbols scrawled in red ink. The lecture hall brimming with students, faculty, cameras, whispers, history, held its breath as though the air itself feared movement might shatter whatever was about to happen. 1,000 eyes watched, yet none truly saw what was unfolding inside him. This wasn't just about math anymore. This was about narrative, power, and the burden of being a black prodigy asked to prove himself under the fluorescent lights of suspicion. He stared at the equation. It was unforgiving, a behemoth of logic and layered theory, filled with misdirections meant to sabotage understanding. Crenshaw had designed it to be a monument to her brilliance, an unsolvable wall to stand behind. But what she hadn't accounted for was that Elijah hadn't grown up walking through open doors. He had spent his life learning to pick locks. Every student in the hall leaned forward unconsciously, like observers at the edge of a precipice. Some were curious, some hungry for a fall, others genuinely hopeful. But the atmosphere felt surgical, clinical observation of a mind, under dissection. Elijah didn't move at first. He let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until the room felt the weight of the moment, the way he did, not as a test, but as a reckoning. Then slowly, he lifted the marker to the board. His first move was simple, too simple in fact. A few students furrowed their brows. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. He wasn't attacking the center of the equation. He was dancing around it, shifting variables in the margins, reframing terms that didn't seem relevant. It looked at first like hesitation, but to the trained eye it wasn't stalling. It was preparation. Elijah was building a foundation. He moved quietly, rewriting a single line into 4 expressions. From those, he pulled an identity, one buried deep within the equation's structure. He replaced a section Crenshaw had intentionally obfuscated, and reversed a transformation that had once appeared irreversible. Slowly, methodically, the entire shape of the problem began to change. What had been a tangle of chaos was now forming into something shockingly elegant. Someone whispered, "He's simplifying it." Another voice said, "No, he's decoding it." Crenshaw stood with arms crossed, the tension in her face taut enough to snap. She recognized what he was doing now. Not solving her problem, but dismantling her methodology. He wasn't playing by her rules. He was rewriting them. Minutes passed. Lines filled the board. Each transformation led into the next, with fluidity, until the equation began resembling something unfamiliar. Not because it was incorrect, but because it was clearer than anyone expected. Elijah's genius wasn't in solving complexity, it was in revealing simplicity on the other side of it. His hand paused above the final line. This was the moment. The climax. The board was almost full, the path complete, but instead of rushing to the answer, Elijah stepped back slightly, looking at what he'd written so far. His brow furrowed, not with uncertainty, but with emotion. He was remembering something. Or someone. He turned and glanced toward the back of the room where a janitor stood near the door pretending to mop, eyes fixed on the board. The man nodded once. It was subtle, quiet, but it said everything. Elijah turned back and wrote the final line. A single transformation. A reveal. A collapse of all prior complexity into a deceptively simple conclusion. Then he capped the marker, stepped away from the board, and looked out over the crowd. No smirk. No defiance. Just stillness. Without a word, he walked out of the lecture hall. He passed Crenshaw without looking at her. Past the rows of students, whose mouths hung open. Past the graduate assistants, who had once doubted his answers. Past a visiting professor who had started clapping but caught himself halfway. And then the door closed behind him. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared at the board. What Elijah had left behind wasn't just a solution. It was a mirror. Crenshaw stepped forward, studying the transformed problem. Her hands trembled slightly. It was correct, not just mathematically, but conceptually. He had found a structure in the equation even she hadn't seen. Something buried, something she had unintentionally hidden beneath her own complexity. Her face paled. One by one, students began to pack up, but their gazes lingered. Some snapped photos of the board. Others stood frozen, not yet ready to leave the echo of what had just happened. Outside, Elijah sat on a bench beneath the trees. His breath was shallow, his hands cold. He hadn't just solved the equation. He had made a decision. He could no longer blend into the back row. He had left something behind on that board that no one could erase. Not Crenshaw, not the whispers, not the rumors. But he also knew what came next. Because in the language of power, a message that clear always demands a response. And somewhere inside that building, someone was already deciding how to strike back. He finishes the equation and walks out silently. The board remains filled with an answer no one can comprehend yet. The chalk dust still clung to the board like residue from a storm. Elijah's solution remained untouched for hours after the lecture ended. Long after the crowd had thinned and Professor Crenshaw had disappeared without a word. No one dared to erase it. Some took photos, others just stood and stared. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was reverence. And as the light shifted through the hall's tall windows, that equation became more than a proof. It became a symbol, a challenge, a mirror. By evening, Elijah's name had already gone viral. Physics forums buzzed with threads titled, "Who is Elijah Maris?" Journalists reached out with interview requests. The university press office tried to manage the firestorm, issuing neutral statements about academic excellence and unexpected student achievements. But the students knew what they had seen. This wasn't just a student doing well. This was a student dismantling an institution's pride in real time, with no fanfare. Inside his dorm room, Elijah sat in darkness. The blinds were drawn. His phone buzzed continuously beside him, glowing with missed calls, unread messages, and Twitter mentions. He hadn't opened any of them. Not even the one from the department chair. He wasn't avoiding the noise. He was trying to breathe beneath it. Because something deeper than fame or fear had begun to stir inside him. Something that felt like memory, or maybe legacy. Then, at exactly 11:37 p.m., a knock came. Not loud, not hesitant, deliberate. Elijah hesitated. Then he opened the door. An older black man stood in the hallway, dressed in a janitor's uniform and heavy boots. His skin was weathered, and the lines on his face looked like they'd been carved by time and truth. In his hands, he held a cardboard box sealed with worn masking tape. His voice was raspy but firm. "You don't know me," the man said, meeting Elijah's eyes. "But I knew your father." Elijah's breath caught. The man glanced at the box. "You need to see this. Not here. Come with me." They walked in silence across campus, through cold air and deeper shadows. The night wrapped around them, like a secret. The man led Elijah into the engineering building, down into the sub-basement where the air smelled like copper and dust. They reached a break room that hadn't been cleaned in years. A dented table sat under a flickering light. The man placed the box on the table. "My name's Walter," he said. "I used to clean the research labs back in the 90s. I saw things they tried to erase. Your father, Maurice Maris, he was a student here, just like you. Brilliant, quiet, way ahead of his time." Elijah sat slowly, his chest tightening. Walter opened the box. Inside were folders, faded diagrams, yellowed papers, and photographs curled at the edges. He pulled one out, a photo of a young black man, standing in front of a chalkboard filled with equations. Elijah leaned forward, eyes wide. The resemblance was uncanny. It was like looking into a mirror warped by time. He solved a version of that same problem, Walter said. The one you cracked this week. He did it first. But they couldn't let it stand. Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. What happened? Walter exhaled slowly. There was a professor here back then, Dr. Richard Lyles. He was Crenshaw's mentor. He watched your father's solution, took his notes and published a paper. When Maurice pushed back, they accused him of plagiarism. Said the work wasn't his. Said the equations were stolen. No hearing, no appeal. They expelled him quietly and buried the story. Elijah's body went cold. His father had never spoken of Sterling. He mentioned his studies only in passing, like fragments from a dream he couldn't revisit. The idea that he had walked these same halls, been erased in the same way Elijah had nearly been, made the past feel like a noose tightening across generations. He never told me, Elijah said. Would you? Walter replied. When the world deletes you, sometimes the only way to survive is to pretend it never happened. Elijah pulled out a sheet from the box. The handwriting was neat and narrow. His father's, the equations written across the page mirrored his own notes from just days ago. Entropy collapse strategies. Thermodynamic feedback loops. Even the phrasing was the same. You didn't just inherit talent, Walter said softly. You inherited unfinished work. One of the folders was labeled Entropy Symmetry Disruption. Prototype Solutions. Elijah's hands trembled as he flipped through it. The math wasn't just advanced, it was familiar. He had arrived at similar formulations independently, a lifetime apart, yet parallel paths. It felt like discovering a second heartbeat inside his chest. But beneath the stack of papers, Walter pulled out one final folder, sealed more tightly than the others. This one, Walter said, is why they really came for him. Elijah opened it carefully. Inside were blueprints, not just theoretical equations, but schematics. A machine, one designed to simulate entropy systems at nonlinear thresholds. It looked decades ahead of its time. The notes were ambitious, borderline revolutionary. Your father was building this. They said it was too speculative, but he knew what it meant. What happened to it? Elijah asked. Walter looked down. After the plagiarism charge, funding dried up. Labs closed their doors. He never got to build it. He left this place broken. Died before he saw anyone take up the work. Elijah stared at the blueprints. His jaw clenched. A strange mixture of grief and resolve hardened inside him. Can I keep this? Walter nodded. It's yours. But know this. People buried this for a reason. Not everyone will want you to dig it back up. That night, back in his dorm, Elijah spread the documents across his desk. The silence in the room felt holy. Pages of his father's work laid beside his own, the margins aligning like puzzle pieces. It was undeniable now. He hadn't just been rediscovering theory. He had been retracing a path his father had been forced to abandon. At 3:12 a.m., an email pinged from the university. We are aware of the recent developments in Thermodynamics 301 and will be reviewing the integrity of all academic proceedings. The statement was cold, clinical. It was a warning. Crenshaw had moved, but Elijah didn't flinch. He opened the next folder and continued reading. Then, at 3:33 a.m., there was another knock. He opened the door. No one. Just a small brown package on the ground, wrapped in paper. No note. No return address. Inside, a single photograph. His father, standing beside a younger Mallory Crenshaw. Behind them, a chalkboard filled with equations. On the back of the photo, someone had scrawled 6 words in red ink. She was there the day he was erased. A retired black janitor on campus reaches out to Elijah with a box of forbidden blueprints from the past. By sunrise, Sterling University was boiling beneath its polished surface. The campus looked calm, red brick buildings, catching the first light, manicured lawns glistening with dew. But beneath the veneer, something volatile churned. Conversations weren't whispers anymore. They were tremors. The faculty listserv lit up before 7 a.m., filled with argumentative threads about Elijah's performance, Crenshaw's conduct, and what the administration called the need to verify academic integrity. Students gathered in clusters, debating loudly. Some defended Elijah with earnest passion. Others accused him of fraud with comfortable confidence. But the ugliest conversations weren't happening among students. They were happening behind closed doors, where tenure protected prejudice like stone shields. Elijah sat at his desk, staring at the photo of his father and Crenshaw, young, smiling, standing in front of a chalkboard like a pair of collaborators instead of a thief and a victim. The blueprints were still spread across the surface like an autopsy of the past. But Elijah wasn't looking at them now. His phone buzzed with Force 42 notifications in the last hour alone. A message from the department chair cut through them all. Elijah, report to the administrative hearing room at 10 a.m. Mandatory. Mandatory, not voluntary. No explanation. His stomach tightened, but he didn't hesitate. He gathered the documents back into Walter's box and tucked the photo inside his notebook. Something told him he would need them. By 9 a.m., campus felt divided. Posters went up on bulletin boards, some praising Elijah, others mocking him. A group of white male students from the physics frat house wore makeshift shirts that read, "Prove it, Maris." A smaller group of black students tried to cover the posters, only to be met with arguments about free speech from bystanders who had never defended freedom until now. Inside the faculty building, the divide was even sharper. A cluster of professors stood near the elevator, their voices sharp enough to cut. He's 17. There's no way he solved that without help. This is dangerous territory, accusing him without evidence. I heard Crenshaw filed an integrity complaint. Well, she would know, or she would lie. Careful, that's tenure you were talking about. The elevator doors opened. Silence spread when Elijah stepped out. The professors stared. Some looked away quickly. Others held his gaze with the cold calculation of people who had already chosen a side. Elijah kept walking. The administrative hearing room was tucked behind the old library, a place rarely used except for internal disputes, nearly all of which involved students of color. Its oak door loomed heavy, carved with the university crest. 2 campus security officers stood beside it. Their presence wasn't standard practice. They weren't there for safety. They were there for intimidation. Inside, the room was dim, the long table lit by a single overhead lamp. 5 faculty board members sat on one side, 3 white men, 1 white woman, and a single black professor whose expression was impossible to read. They all had folders in front of them, sealed. Elijah stood across from them, hands at his sides. "Mr. Maris," said the chair, a silver-haired physicist named Dr. Keaton, "this is an academic integrity review. You were summoned to respond to concerns raised regarding your recent performance in thermodynamics. Elijah breathed steadily. "What concerns?" Keaton adjusted his glasses. "Your ability to solve a previously unsolved equation has caused questions." "It wasn't unsolved," Elijah replied calmly. "Not if my father solved it first." The room shifted. The black professor leaned forward slightly. Keaton frowned. "Your father's involvement here is irrelevant." Elijah's voice remained steady. "It's very relevant. We'll determine what's relevant." Keaton snapped too quickly for someone pretending neutrality. Another professor, a thin, severe woman, leaned back. "Before we proceed, you should know that students are not entitled to legal representation in academic hearings." Elijah blinked. "I didn't ask for a lawyer." "Good," she said, "because you won't be allowed one." The air tightened. Elijah steadied himself. "May I know who filed the complaint?" he asked quietly. The chair's lips pressed thin. "A faculty member." "That's not an answer." Before Keaton could respond, the door behind Elijah creaked open. He turned. Professor Mallory Crenshaw walked in, heels clicking slowly across the wooden floor. She didn't sit. She didn't greet anyone. She carried a single black folder in her hand, thick, overstuffed, and warped at the edges like it had been handled too many times. She walked directly to the table and let the folder drop with a heavy slap. "I believe this proves he cheated," she said. The room stiffened. Elijah exhaled. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was the move he had been waiting for. The strike he knew would come the moment he refused to shrink. Keaton opened the folder, flipping through pages with exaggerated care. It was filled with copies of Elijah's homework assignments, printouts of his notes that she must have photographed, online forum discussions, accusations scribbled in red pen. Crenshaw crossed her arms. "I've been reviewing his patterns," she said. "His derivations don't match undergraduate consistency. His approach suggests prior familiarity with unpublished material. The only logical explanation is that he had access to someone else's research." The implication hung in the air like poison. She wasn't just accusing Elijah of cheating. She was accusing him of stealing, just like they had accused his father. Elijah's jaw tightened, but Crenshaw wasn't done. Additionally, she continued, a former student of mine, now a postdoc, was able to find identical structures in old archived lab notes. Notes that were never publicly released. How would a freshman know them? Elijah clenched his fists. Because they were my father's, almost left his lips. But Walter had warned him. Not everything buried should be unearthed in the open. One of the professors asked, do we have evidence he accessed these notes? Crenshaw's smile was small and sharp. Not yet, but the similarities cannot be accidental. The black professor finally spoke, his voice deep and deliberate. Similarity is not proof. Genius is not proof. And your discomfort, he said looking at Crenshaw, is not proof. Crenshaw's eyes flashed. It's not discomfort, she said coldly. It's academic preservation. No, Elijah whispered. It's fear. For the first time, a few faculty members looked shaken. Keaton cleared his throat. Mr. Maris, do you have anything to say before we review Dr. Crenshaw's claims? Elijah reached into his bag, heart pounding. He pulled out the photograph, the one of his father and a young Crenshaw standing together in front of a chalkboard. He placed it gently on the table. I have this, he said. Crenshaw's face drained of color. Keaton picked up the photo. What is this? My father, Elijah said quietly. And Professor Crenshaw, 25 years ago. Crenshaw opened her mouth but no sound came out. Elijah continued. He was a thermodynamics prodigy. He solved equations just like I do. He was expelled for plagiarism after someone stole his work. A murmur spread across the room. Even the air felt stunned. Keaton frowned deeply. Professor Crenshaw, you were here then? She didn't answer. Elijah's voice was steady now, rising like a tide. I didn't cheat. I inherited a legacy, one this institution tried to bury. He looked at each professor directly. You are not reviewing my integrity. You're reviewing your own. Silence. Crenshaw finally inhaled, shaking. This means nothing. That photo, those notes, none of it proves anything. She slammed her fist onto the folder. This does. Elijah stared at the folder, then at her. The room waited. Crenshaw straightened her spine. I am requesting academic suspension until further investigation. The black professor spoke again. You can request anything you want, but your motives, he said calmly, are officially in question. Crenshaw's face contorted anger, fear, pride all pulsing beneath her skin. And then, she snapped. If you won't see the truth, she hissed, I will force it. She pulled out one last paper from the folder and slammed it on the table. This, she said, is the proof you're all too blind to see. The board members leaned forward, and Elijah's heart stopped. Dr. Crenshaw walks in and tosses a folder on the table. I believe this proves he cheated. The moment Crenshaw slammed the final paper on the table, Elijah saw the script unfolding exactly as she intended. The accusation wasn't just about a formula anymore. It was about rewriting history before the truth could surface. As the academic board flipped through the planted documents, manufactured timestamps, false access logs, scattered notations designed to look familiar, Elijah realized they were more than suspicious. They were strategic, preemptive. She had prepared this in case he ever got too close. But Elijah didn't panic. He didn't flinch. Because what Crenshaw hadn't accounted for, what none of them had, was that Elijah already knew she was hiding something bigger than a forged accusation. She was hiding a history buried in red bricks and sealed archives. As soon as he left the hearing, without waiting for any decision, Elijah walked straight across campus. His steps were calm but full of purpose. Past students debating on benches. Past professors who wouldn't meet his eyes. Past security guards, whose radios crackled with silent tension. He headed not for a dorm, not for his advisor, but for the only place where institutions bury the things they fear most. The archives. Tucked beneath the oldest wing of Sterling's library. The archives felt more like a vault than a library. Cold. Stone-walled. Dimly lit. A maze of silent corridors. Few students ever came here. Fewer knew it existed. And yet, one person had been waiting. A gray-haired librarian, with a soft voice and sharper eyes than anyone on faculty. Miriam Holt. She looked up from her desk as Elijah entered, her expression unreadable. I know why you're here, she said simply. Elijah froze. You do. Miriam nodded and rose slowly. Your father came here once. Quiet boy. Eyes like yours. He had questions no one wanted answered. She didn't ask him to explain. She just motioned for him to follow her through the labyrinth of cabinets and sealed drawers, each labeled by decade and department. They reached a rusted cabinet sealed with a key lock and a metal security tag. These, Miriam said, are faculty research records, pre-2000s, most never digitized, some intentionally. She selected a small brass key from her ring and opened the drawer with a slow creak. Inside were dozens of folders bound with red tape. She handed him gloves. Originals degrade fast. Be careful. Elijah sifted through them until he found it. Entropy Constructs. Lyles. Crenshaw. 1998. The cover was handwritten, faded. Inside, the pages were dense. Technical formulas, experimental annotations, scribbled observations. It wasn't just research. It was a blueprint for how Crenshaw built her entire academic reputation. But as he turned page after page, he noticed something strange. On page 47, the equation suddenly changed.
Not evolved. Changed.
A variable carefully defined in earlier drafts disappeared completely. Not replaced, not adjusted, just gone. And with its removal, the entire structure of the equation became unsolvable. Elijah's chest tightened. Miriam looked over his shoulder. You found it. You knew? She nodded. Your father fought to keep that variable in. He said the equation without it wasn't a test. It was a trap. Crenshaw and Lyles overruled him.
Elijah's pulse raced.
So the unsolvable problem she built her career on was sabotaged from the start. It was never meant to be solved, Miriam said. It was meant to be attempted so students could fail, especially the ones they feared might succeed. Elijah sat back, stunned. He understood now. Crenshaw hadn't just erased his father. She had weaponized his work, and the moment Elijah solved it, he became the living evidence of her lie. I need more than this, he said. I need proof she knew. Miriam reached beneath her desk and pulled out another folder. I was hoping you'd ask. Inside were letters, personal correspondence between Maurice Maris and other researchers, warning them of alterations being made to his equations. One letter was chilling. It detailed how he was being pressured to stop pushing back, and how his files were slowly being restricted. At the bottom of the folder was a photograph. Two figures stood in a dim lab space, both in white coats. Maurice Maris and a young Mallory Crenshaw. They weren't smiling. Not really. Her expression was fixed, his distant. But what struck Elijah most was the chalkboard behind them. The original equation, with the missing variable, was fully written out. This wasn't just evidence. This was betrayal. Crenshaw hadn't been an innocent bystander. She had been there. She had watched Maurice's work get erased. She had watched him get expelled. And she had said nothing. Or worse, she had helped. Elijah stared at the photo for a long time. His hands trembled. Not from fear, but from restraint. Because the rage swelling inside him now wasn't blind. It was focused, controlled. He looked up. Why did you keep all this? Miriam shrugged lightly. Because I was never allowed to forget. I kept it hoping someone would come looking. Someone who knew what the silence meant. I'm going to finish what he started, Elijah said, closing the folder slowly. But not in shadows, not behind closed doors. Miriam studied him for a moment, then smiled. Then you'd better be ready. Because once this gets out, the storm won't wait. Elijah nodded. He gathered the letters, the photo, the blueprints. Every piece of paper they had tried to bury now felt like armor. He walked out of the archives and into the light of the afternoon, clutching the truth in his hands, not as a shield, but as a weapon, because this time, they weren't going to erase him. Elijah finds a photo of his father and Crenshaw together in the original research lab. The truth didn't just live in documents and photographs. It breathed in memory, buried in the static of forgotten voices, and the fine print of institutional betrayal. Elijah sat cross-legged on his dorm floor, the scattered evidence around him like pieces of a fallen empire, pages of blueprints, letters written in trembling ink. A photo of his father and a young Crenshaw in a lab no one talked about anymore. But what drew his attention now was the smallest artifact of all. It was hidden inside an unmarked envelope, tucked at the bottom of the folder Miriam had given him. Wrapped in yellowing tissue paper was a microcassette, old and delicate, with a handwritten label. If they come for you too, fight different. Elijah stared at the cassette, his heart racing. His fingers trembled as he held it. It was his father's handwriting. The ink faded, but the message sharp, a warning, a passing of the torch. But he didn't have a player. It took 2 hours and 3 favors from tech-savvy classmates. But by nightfall, Elijah sat alone in the university's digital media lab. Headphones on, cassette finally converted to digital. He pressed play. At first just static. Then a voice. Calm. Steady. Familiar in ways that made Elijah's throat tighten. "If you're hearing this," Maurice Maris said, "it means they came for you too." Elijah's eyes shut, as his father's voice filled the room. A voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice not just from the past, but from a moment before the world had turned cruel. "I tried to outthink them, tried to play their game clean, thought if I worked hard enough, kept quiet enough, they'd have to let me through." Maurice paused. "I was wrong." Elijah's hands gripped the desk. They changed the equation. Took out a variable. Claimed I'd stolen ideas I created from nothing but blood and sleep deprivation. Mallory, she was there. Watched it all. Said we were in it together. Until the room got quiet. Then it was her word, not mine, that mattered. A long silence followed. Then Maurice spoke again, this time lower. "They let her rise, and I disappeared. No hearing, no investigation, just silence. So I left. But if you're my son, and if you're hearing this, that means you found what I left behind." Elijah leaned forward. "Don't do what I did. Don't stay quiet. Don't try to make them comfortable. Fight different. Fight loud. Truth is your inheritance now. Use it." The tape clicked to silence. Elijah didn't move. His father hadn't died defeated. He had been extinguished by a machine designed to protect itself. Crenshaw had built her throne from the ashes of a black genius, and now she was trying to repeat history. But Elijah had found the proof, and more importantly, he had found his father's voice. Flashback. Sterling University. The research lab was colder than usual that night. Maurice Maris stood at the chalkboard, exhausted, chalk in hand, the curve of the entropy formula taking shape beneath his fingers. He had spent weeks refining it, an elegant solution to a problem scholars claimed couldn't be solved, not with the current tools, not by someone like him. Mallory Crenshaw stood across the room, arms folded, watching him closely. "You're really going to submit it like that?" she asked. Maurice didn't look at her. "It works. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying they won't accept it. They'll have to. The math is clean." Mallory stepped forward, voice softening. "Maurice, come on. You know how they see you. You drop this formula on them raw, and you'll scare the hell out of them. Let's clean it up together. Present it as a team." Maurice turned, finally facing her. "You mean put your name on it?" She didn't deny it. "They'll take it seriously if it comes from both of us." Maurice stared at her. "You mean if it comes from you?" A pause stretched between them. Mallory looked away first.
I'm trying to help you, Maurice.
"No," he said, "you're trying to help yourself." The next day, Maurice submitted the formula under his name. 3 days later, the department launched a plagiarism investigation. Someone had anonymously accused him of stealing the equation from another student's thesis. One Mallory had helped edit the year before. The department seized his notes, restricted his lab access, announced a closed-door review. And in the middle of it all, Mallory stood silent, not defending him, not denying him, just watching. Maurice fought. He submitted his original notebooks, his drafts, his process. But the department ruled that the evidence of originality was inconclusive. His academic standing was revoked. His project was reassigned. The formula was stripped from his name and reattributed to collaborative departmental findings. Mallory's name appeared on the next paper published using his methods. He packed up his dorm room in silence. No protest, no riot. Because when the system erases you, sometimes the loudest scream is swallowed before it even reaches your throat. Back in the present, Elijah sat motionless. The tape, the photo, the erased variable. It all connected. Sterling University had chosen which genius to uplift, and which one to bury, and now the son of the one they buried had returned, with the truth his father left behind. But Elijah wasn't Maurice. He wasn't going to leave in silence. He reached for his laptop and opened a blank document. At the top he typed, "The equation they didn't want solved, a black legacy erased." Because this wasn't just about physics anymore. It was about history. And history was about to remember. Elijah finds a microcassette recording labeled, "If they come for you too, fight different." The video was never supposed to exist. Professor Crenshaw had long enforced a strict no-phones policy during her lectures, framed as an intellectual discipline measure, but more likely a tool to control the narrative. But someone, a sharp sophomore with a cracked iPhone and a sharpened sense of justice, hit record the moment Elijah stepped toward the board. That student captured everything. The ambush, the silent tension, the chalk scratching its own defiance across the slate. It showed Elijah, calm and deliberate, solving the impossible. It showed Crenshaw unraveling before a silent crowd, her expressions betraying fear beneath her forced poise. The footage hit Twitter like a detonation. At first it was a whisper. Shared among a few black STEM students, it was met with a collective pause. Then the pause turned into rage. Within 12 hours, the video hit 1 million views. In less than a day, Elijah's name was trending alongside hashtags that bore the weight of generations. Elijah Maris. Maurice Maris was first. Let black geniuses breathe. She watched him fall. Threads exploded. One former Sterling alum detailed how Crenshaw had questioned their test scores during undergrad, citing anomalous patterns. Another unearthed screenshots of her past research acknowledgments. Never once had she credited black collaborators, despite years of working in diverse labs. Someone uploaded a side-by-side comparison of Crenshaw's famous entropy equation and Maurice Maris's unpublished notes. The resemblance was undeniable. Then came the memes. They swept across timelines with the force of a cultural uprising. A still frame of Elijah walking away from the board was captioned, "Silent Exits. Loud Legacies." Another featured Crenshaw's frozen stare next to the equation. When you plagiarize the father then get schooled by the son. TikToks popped up with reenactments, stitched reactions, and even math breakdowns for non-STEM users. Black Twitter wasn't just angry, it was strategic, small, unrelenting. Mainstream media followed within hours. CNN aired a special segment, Academic Apartheid, the Elijah Maris story. MSNBC featured black physicists who had been gatekept from Ivy League tenure. Even BuzzFeed posted a viral list, 7 reasons why Elijah Maris just redefined genius. But the virality came with a double edge. Beneath the wave of celebration, the backlash festered. Right-wing pundits mocked the situation. Elijah's emails were flooded with both love and hate. Anonymous accounts posted veiled threats. One extremist message read, "We know where you sleep, genius." The campus shifted overnight. Some professors tiptoed around the topic, refusing to engage. Others were vocal, either defending Crenshaw's reputation or quietly standing behind Elijah. Students wore shirts with handwritten equations. Others staged teach-ins in the courtyard. A group of Crenshaw loyalists formed an unofficial faction called Guardians of Academic Rigor, claiming Elijah's fame was manufactured. Their slogans were barely veiled racism, dressed in the language of scholarship. Meanwhile, Elijah watched the chaos swirl around him from a distance. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but symbols don't get to choose. The university issued a statement drenched in legalese. "We are committed to thoroughly investigating all concerns raised and ensuring academic fairness. No apology, no accountability. Just damage control." But that same night, something unexpected happened. A link surfaced in a Reddit thread titled, "Things Crenshaw Didn't Want You to See." It led to a dump of private emails, allegedly from Crenshaw's university account. The source? Anonymous. The content? Explosive. One email, dated 2 weeks before the lecture ambush, read, "If the Maris boy tries to outshine the board again, I'll remind everyone whose theory this really is." Another referred to Maurice Maris's original project as departmental debris. The most damning was addressed to a faculty peer. "Tenure means I get to correct history when it tries to rewrite itself in real time." Screenshots flooded Twitter within minutes. Elijah sat frozen in his dorm room, as his phone lit up with every alert imaginable. Not just from friends, allies, or classmates, but from journalists, podcasters, TV producers. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone wanted his voice. But Elijah wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. Because buried in the leaked messages was something else. An attachment labeled Project E Legacy Lock. He downloaded it. Inside the folder was a series of redacted memos, departmental communications dating back to 1995. And at the bottom, a scanned authorization form bearing the signatures of several faculty members, including Mallory Crenshaw's. It authorized the archival suppression of Maurice Maris's lab access, stating he had demonstrated an inability to collaborate within academic norms. They hadn't just stolen his work, They institutionalized the theft. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Every lie told in polished classrooms, every nod passed off as mentorship, every phrase like he's promising, or she's difficult. It was all part of a quiet war that had raged long before he was born. But now, it was public. Now the world was watching. Outside his window, students gathered in the courtyard again. This time they weren't just protesting, they were organizing, holding vigils, teaching Maurice's original equations on makeshift whiteboards, creating zines that mapped racism in STEM. The university couldn't silence this. Elijah stood and reached for the folder with his father's photo. He taped it to the inside of his dorm door. Then beneath it, he scrawled in marker, not just his son, his proof. And then, his phone buzzed again. A new headline breaking across Twitter. Crenshaw's emails hint at more than one buried legacy. Crenshaw's private emails are hacked, and the leaks hint she's buried more than just Maurice's legacy. What started as a protest quickly evolved into a cultural reckoning. By the third day, Sterling University's perfectly manicured campus was transformed into a groundswell of student-led resistance. Tents lined the once pristine quad, like a battlefield headquarters. Flyers fluttered in the wind. The marble steps of the administration building were now a stage, where speakers voiced truths the institution had buried for generations. At the center of it all, scrawled across a massive rolling whiteboard in permanent red marker, were two names that refused to be silenced: Maurice Maris and Elijah Maris. Classes were canceled, not by official decree, but by collective choice. Lecture halls stood empty as students flooded the campus commons, replacing coursework with teach-ins and digital broadcasts. Live streams from the quad pulled in thousands of viewers nationwide. Topics ranged from racism in research labs to how legacy admissions protect white mediocrity. Guest speakers arrived: Black physicists, civil rights historians, and alumni who had been denied entry into Sterling's prestigious programs. They told stories of microaggressions wrapped in policy, of brilliance punished because it came from the wrong skin. Everywhere you looked, the signs were clear. Not just a moment, a reckoning. STEM was never neutral. Maurice solved it first. While the students spoke with power, the silence from the administration was deafening. Crenshaw had vanished. Her office door was closed and dark, her nameplate removed. Whispers spread that she had been placed on leave, but no confirmation came. Behind closed doors, the faculty fractured. Some demanded her resignation. Others clung to the illusion of academic neutrality, arguing for due process and context. But it wasn't the student unrest that shook the university leadership to its core. It was the alumni. Donations were pulled. Legacy donors issued open letters calling for a full investigation. Social media exploded with testimonials from graduates who had once loved Sterling, now revealing the racism they had experienced behind its ivy-covered walls. A former Rhodes Scholar posted a scathing video: "I succeeded despite Sterling, not because of it." Then came the curriculum leaks. An anonymous Dropbox link was shared on Reddit, claiming to contain internal committee memos. It was legitimate. Hundreds of pages dating back decades. Documents from admissions boards, department chairs, and hiring panels. The language was technical, coded, but the intent was unmistakable. Phrases like departmental cohesion, calibrated potential, and social compatibility were used repeatedly to justify rejecting applicants of color. One 2006 memo warned of overrepresentation from urban public schools, while another in 2011 suggested a cap on demographic volatility in STEM spaces. The outrage was immediate and volcanic. News outlets seized the story. Headlines screamed across platforms: Sterling University's quiet war on black excellence. Institutional racism in academia, a case study unfolding in real time. The curriculum that erased a generation. The university president, a man once praised for being forward-facing, released a video address, standing before the administration building in a tailored suit, his voice carefully modulated. He spoke of regret and reflection. He announced the formation of a new Truth and Equity Commission, pledging to review the university's academic history. But his words sounded like PR rehearsals. The internet wasn't buying it. Elijah watched all of this unfold in silence. He received over 400 interview requests. Networks begged him for exclusives. Celebrities tweeted in support. But Elijah declined every invitation. He wasn't interested in being a face for someone else's narrative. The truth didn't need to be repackaged in polished media reels. It was already speaking, loud and raw through every leaked document, every protest chant, every furious tweet. One evening he wandered through the quad long after the cameras had packed up and the energy had dimmed. The tents were still there, illuminated by campfire flickers. A group of students sat around a metal barrel converted into a fire pit, passing hot chocolate and laptops. They looked up when he passed. No one asked for a photo. No one bombarded him with praise. One simply nodded and handed him a marker. The giant whiteboard still stood, weather-worn but defiant. Underneath his father's name, someone had scrawled, uncredited, undeniable. Elijah stepped forward and wrote just one word beneath it, unburied. The following morning, a new email landed in his inbox. It came from the office of the president. Subject: Emergency Faculty Assembly. Request for your presence. No long-winded explanation. Just a formal invitation to speak before the full faculty council. Not a panel. Not a student forum. The very same people who had once celebrated Crenshaw's career, now forced to reckon with the cracks beneath their ivory pedestal. Elijah closed the email and stared out the window.
The reckoning wasn't over.
It was only beginning. An emergency faculty meeting is called, and Elijah is invited to speak. The lecture hall looked different now. Not physically. Its walls were still the same pale beige, its rows still lined with polished wooden desks, but emotionally, it hummed with a tension that was almost alive. As Elijah stepped inside, the room fell into a heavy silence. Hundreds of faculty members, graduate assistants, and administrative officials sat waiting. Some leaned forward, others folded their arms tightly, but all eyes were on him. He recognized the space too well. It was the same hall where he had once been singled out, doubted, examined like a specimen under a microscope. The same hall where Crenshaw had tried to break him in front of 300 students. But today, he wasn't the quiet boy in the back row. Today he stood at the podium, not to prove himself, but to expose what had been hidden in the shadows for too long. The university president introduced him stiffly, as if hoping his neutrality would somehow soften the storm. Elijah Maris has been invited to share his perspective, he said, though everyone knew this wasn't an invitation. It was a reckoning forced by truth, by evidence, by a campus that refused to look away. Elijah took a breath and adjusted the microphone. His voice, when he began, was calm, steady in a way that made the room lean. "I'm not here to talk about one equation," he said. "I'm here to talk about the system that decides who gets to be called a genius." Some faculty members shifted uncomfortably. He continued. "When I walked into Sterling, I was quiet because I thought brilliance spoke for itself, but I learned fast that silence doesn't protect you. It only helps the people who benefit from your disappearance." Several professors looked down at their hands. "This institution teaches physics," Elijah said, "but it also teaches something else: how to survive systems built on erasure." He clicked the laptop connected to the projector. The screen illuminated with two side-by-side equations, one from Maurice Maris's notebook, and one from Crenshaw's published paper. "These aren't coincidences," Elijah said. "They're fingerprints." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. "My father solved this problem 30 years ago. He was expelled because a system of power feared what it meant for a black mind to outpace the people who controlled the narrative. The same mechanism tried to silence me. Not because I cheated, but because I wasn't supposed to solve what they designed to be unsolvable." He let the words settle like dust. A professor raised a hand. "Mr. Maris, are you implying intent?" Elijah didn't answer defensively. His voice was almost gentle. "I'm saying intent doesn't matter when the outcome is the same. Black excellence gets treated like a threat." Soft gasps traveled across the hall. He clicked again. The screen shifted to the leaked curriculum memos, the redacted policies, the coded language, the exclusion strategies. "This," Elijah said, "is the real curriculum students of color learn at Sterling." He spoke without rage, without theatrics. His power came from clarity. Every word struck with precision. "We learn that if we're brilliant, people will question whether we cheated. If we're quiet, they'll call us unprepared. If we excel, they'll say it's a fluke. And if we fail, they'll say it proves the system works." The president stiffened. "We learn that institutions don't need to shout to erase us. All they need is silence. Policies written behind closed doors. Mentorship offered selectively. Opportunities rationed out like oxygen. Not a single person moved. My father didn't survive this place," Elijah said quietly. "And I almost didn't either. But I won't stay silent, because silence was the tool they used to erase him." I won't let it be the tool used to erase me. He paused, then added, brilliance doesn't need permission, and truth doesn't need protection. The projector shut off, and the room plunged back into dimness. Elijah stepped away from the podium. He didn't plead for policy changes or demand apologies. He didn't need to. He had given them something they couldn't ignore, evidence bound with truth bound with history bound with a voice they had tried to silence. The university board immediately convened on the stage, shuffling papers and whispering fiercely among themselves. Tension radiated through the room. Faculty watched with held breath as the board prepared to vote on Crenshaw's fate, tenure review, suspension, dismissal. The president cleared his throat. We will now review the evidence and testimonies presented. A vote will follow. But before he could continue, the doors at the back of the hall creaked open. Every head turned. A man stepped inside, older, wearing a simple maintenance jacket, his boots dusty from the campus grounds. His posture was tired but steady, and his eyes carried years of
Walter.
the retired janitor who had once worked in the same labs as Maurice Maris. He walked down the center aisle, each step echoing louder than the president's voice. Sir, the president said sharply, this is a closed faculty assembly. Walter didn't stop walking. I was here in '95, he said, his voice steady. I watched how they erased Maurice. I watched who signed the papers. And I kept the things they tried to bury. He held up a folder. The room froze. Elijah's heart pounded. Crenshaw's fate was no longer just a vote. It was about to become a confession. The board votes on Crenshaw's fate, and a voice from her past returns to testify. Walter's folder was thin, but the moment he handed it to the board, it felt heavier than anything that had passed through that hall in decades. The contents weren't just papers, they were history, preserved in ink and silence. As he opened it, time unraveled. Printed emails, lab notes, department memos. One page stood out, a lab draft signed by Maurice Maris, with a single line scribbled in the margin. Entropy trap model, final complete. It was the very equation that had launched Crenshaw's career. The room held its breath. I saw them take his work, Walter said, his voice unshaken. I saw who watched. I saw who walked away. I saw who gained from it. Every faculty member shifted uneasily. Eyes darted, and then they turned toward Crenshaw's empty chair. For a long moment, it seemed she might not come. But then the side doors opened. She walked in slowly, dressed not in her usual high-collared blazer or crisp white shirt, but in plain black. Her posture wasn't the same, either. The proud shoulders had dropped. The chin wasn't lifted. Something had cracked, not just publicly, but inwardly. And yet she walked with purpose, as if knowing the weight of what was coming couldn't be dodged. She didn't wait to be invited to the front. She walked straight to the podium. I won't waste your time, she began, her voice thinner, stripped of her usual precision. The documents are real. A hush fell over the auditorium. Maurice Maris wrote that equation. He wrote the draft. He solved the model. He finished the entropy trap I built. My name on. A collective inhale surged through the faculty. I didn't challenge it, because it was wrong, she continued. I challenged it because I couldn't believe someone like him had seen what I hadn't. I watched his mind work in ways I couldn't keep up with. I felt it. The fear, the jealousy. And then I turned that fear into erasure. Her hands trembled slightly at the podium. The department gave us an opportunity to present together, but I knew that if we did, I'd always be the footnote. So I lied. I said he'd stolen the data. I knew it wasn't true. I signed off on the reports that revoked his access. And then I stepped into the space he was removed from. I took the credit. I built a legacy on it. No one interrupted. No one even blinked. I spent the rest of my career protecting that lie. When Elijah arrived, I didn't see a student. I saw a ghost, a mirror, a reckoning. Her voice cracked now. So I pushed him. I made him a target. I wanted him to fail. Because if he succeeded, I'd have to admit that the story I built my life around wasn't just flawed. It was stolen. She looked around the room. I resign. Effective immediately. No severance. No honorary titles. No legacy. And with that, Mallory Crenshaw turned and walked out of the same doors she entered, leaving behind decades of silence collapsing under the weight of a single confession. The board sat stunned. Papers shuffled. Words were attempted, then abandoned. For once the walls of Sterling held nothing but truth, and they didn't know what to do with it. But the students did. By nightfall, demands had poured into the president's office. Crenshaw's resignation was not enough. They wanted Maurice Maris's name restored to every paper, every textbook, every dataset where his work had been buried. They wanted a public apology on every official university channel. They demanded scholarships be named in his honor. They called for curriculum reform that would hold Sterling accountable, not just for the past, but for the system still alive in the present. And beyond all that, they wanted proof. Proof that the university would never let this happen again. Proof that legacy wasn't a privilege. It was earned. Elijah didn't wait for the board's next meeting. He left the auditorium quietly, the same way he had walked out after solving the board weeks ago. No fanfare, no celebration, just silence, his own. This time, not imposed but chosen. A silence filled with dignity. A silence that echoed louder than applause. That evening, as he returned to his dorm room, something waited for him on the floor. An envelope. Sealed. Stamped. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His heart paused. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, printed on official letterhead, with one line bolded at the top. We would like to formally offer you the Maris Research Chair in Thermodynamics, a position originally promised to your father before it was rescinded without cause. It continued, the legacy is yours. Welcome to MIT. Elijah receives a letter from MIT, offering him his father's once-promised research chair. The sun rose on a campus that no longer looked the same. The quad was quieter now, the tents mostly packed up, but something far more permanent had settled into the soil of Sterling University. Change wasn't just whispered anymore. It was written, recorded, refused to be erased. Elijah stood near the same steps where it had all begun. In one hand, he held the official offer from MIT. In the other, the worn blueprint with his father's initials finally restored, in clear black ink. Maurice Maris, Entropy Variant 3.1. It felt sacred, not just because it had been stolen, but because it had endured, through lies, through time, through silence. But Elijah wasn't heading to MIT yet. There was one thing left to do. He made his way through the quiet back corridors of Sterling, past the shuttered physics labs, until he reached the maintenance wing. The door was open. Inside, Walter was packing up a stack of tools into a battered red box. He looked up, unsurprised. I figured you'd come back, he said with a nod. Elijah stepped forward and held out the blueprint. This belongs to you, he said. You kept it alive. You kept him alive. Walter stared at the paper for a long time before gently taking it in his hands. His eyes glistened, but he didn't cry. I just made sure history didn't get too comfortable lying, he murmured. But you gave it back its voice. They sat in silence for a moment, not awkward, but reverent. 2 generations of truth. One who lived it, one who corrected it. Walter broke the quiet. What will you do with it now? The name? The legacy? Elijah looked out the small window. I'll carry it, but I won't let it be the weight that drowns me. It'll be a foundation. That afternoon, students and faculty gathered in the main courtyard for what was announced as a restorative commemoration. Most didn't know what to expect. Rumors had swirled for days. The protest organizers stood shoulder to shoulder with alumni. The president took the stage and for once didn't speak first. It was Elijah. He walked calmly to the mic, his expression unreadable but focused. I didn't come here to be a hero, he began. And I didn't stay to be a martyr. I stayed because truth has a right to be loud, even when it enters quietly. Behind him, a large black cloth was pulled away. A bronze statue stood in the center of the courtyard. It wasn't of Elijah. It was Maurice Maris. The figure was captured mid-thought, eyes to the sky, one hand holding a notepad, the other mid-gesture toward a chalkboard carved in metal. At the statue's base, the inscription read, Maurice Maris, 1968, 1996. Erased but not forgotten. The brilliance they feared. The genius they couldn't. Silence. The crowd stood silent. Then, applause. Then tears. Then a chant. Maurice Maris. Maurice Maris. Elijah didn't speak again. He simply stepped back, turned toward the administration building, and walked away. Later that night, his dorm was empty. His books were packed. The MIT letter rested on his desk, along with a new journal titled Project Maris, Legacy Beyond Equations. The room felt lighter now, not because the pain was gone, but because it had been named. He paused before closing the door. Then he left Sterling behind. As the story neared its end, the camera would pan one final time across the campus, past the statue, past the dorms, past the quad, into a darkened faculty office. Deep in the older wing of the university, a shadow sat at a desk, hunched over a weathered notebook. It wasn't Crenshaw. It was another professor, white, quiet, unnoticed. In his hands a different notebook, worn dusty, but with a name on the inside cover not his own. He turned the page and began to copy. As the credits roll, the camera pans to a white professor watching from the shadows, holding another stolen notebook. Some stories aren't just about brilliance. They're about survival in a world that fears it. Elijah didn't ask to be a symbol, but when they tried to erase his name, he wrote it louder. If this story moved you, type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if this broke your heart.